This is my phylum project archive for organism number 10, and this is phylum Mollusca. So this phylum has some major characteristics, and the first are anatomical. All organisms in this phylum must have a mantle, radula, and a nervous system. And the mantle is the outer shell, the radula is the part that runs in between the snell and the nervous system is the nerves. This phylum is the second largest invertebrate phylum with 200,000 species, and there are 6 distinct and non-extinct classes of mollusca organisms. There are also some classes that are extinct, but they're not mentioned here. And the class that we're studying today is Gastropoda, which contains snails, slugs, abalone, conch, limpets, sea hares, and sea butterflies. Most of the organisms in this phylum are found in aquatic ecosystems, but the organisms from the class that we're studying are typically found in terrestrial ecosystems. So that's a distinguishment from the rest of the phylum. The specific organism in question is Oxyochilus salarius, and the common name for this organism is the cellar glass snail. The name Oxychilus comes from the Greek words oxy and chiles, meaning acidic and juicy. Oxy can also be called sharp, which might be a reference to the reproductive system of Oxyochilus salarius, where there's a sharp protrusion from an otherwise soft mass. But beyond that, it likely refers to the fact that most snails are acidic or have a garlic scent that they can give off for some kind of defense mechanism. They're juicy, they're soft organisms that must have an abundance of calcium to have a shell to protect themselves, and without this abundance, they're just a mushy kind of pile. Salarius comes from the observation that this organism is commonly found in cellars, and together this name describes a pungent, juicy organism found in cellars. So here's some images. This was found at my house in Greensboro, North Carolina. And how you can tell that this is a salarius snail and not another one is the shell. It has 5 to 6 whorls, and the organism is a darker brown, but in the light, it was actually more of a lighter gray, lighter blue. You can tell there's a shadow there. That's me with it. So the mode of nutrition, also just a few characteristic features here. It has these little antennae that it uses to sense the presence of other snails. This is an adaptation that helps it to survive because most snails are blind and they cannot hear. So as a result, they have to be able to feel and sniff, and these antennas can also sense the chemicals released by other snails. Snails are chemoheterotrophs, but they prey on both plants and animals. Some food sources are dead and living plants, other snails and slugs, earthworms, fungi, snail eggs, and sow bugs. Snails are actually cannibalistic, so when they're born, they need an abundance of calcium, and they'll get this by eating their own shell, which they hatched from, and this will help them to form their actual shell that they need. However, the more calcium they can consume, the faster they can grow and the less likely they are to die, so they'll often consume their brothers and sisters that have yet to hatch. They inhale carbon through breathing pores, and as a result, they get their carbon from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And then they must perform cellular respiration to convert the resources acquired from consuming other animals. So that's the chemo part of the chemoheterotroph, and the carbon from the atmosphere into usable forms. And remember, a chemoheterotroph is an organism that consumes other organisms and then undergoes chemical processes such as cellular respiration to convert the nutrients consumed when eating the other organisms into a usable form that can sustain their own life functions. These organisms undergo gametic meiosis, meaning there's an egg cell and a sperm cell, and they come together to produce one gamete, which develops into a fetus, which eventually hatches. And most snails are hermaphrodites, which means that they have both male and female reproductive organs. They reach sexual maturity from 6 weeks to 5 years of age, depending on the species and depending on their environmental conditions. So as I was talking about earlier, they have to have an abundance of calcium. If they don't have an abundance of this calcium, they won't develop their shell as quickly, and they won't be able to grow as quickly because they'll be stuck in the shell size that's fit for a lower amount of calcium. However, when this high abundance of calcium is present, they can grow much more quickly, and this will allow them to reach sexual maturity sooner because they'll be their full size. And they sexually reproduce through a mating pore that's on their head. It protrudes when they're sexually attracted to another organism and during mating season. They then shoot love darts at each other to hold themselves in place. These darts penetrate the skin and can be deadly if they cause internal organ damage. So it is a bit of a dangerous courtship process, but it's what they do. And these love darts release chemicals that make the sperm more likely to find eggs. And fertilization occurs through ejaculation, and it may be mutual. Because most snails are hermaphrodites, they can ejaculate both at the same time into each other, and then they'll both lay eggs 1 to 2 weeks later. And they'll do this when they feel that the environment is best suited for their young to proliferate. Some snails prefer to not go through this process, and they will self-fertilize, which they are capable of doing, but it's still gametic meiosis because they still have the sperm cell and the egg cell, because they have both male and female reproductive organs. And the life cycle of snails, it starts at hatchlings, and they hatch 1 to 2 weeks after being laid. So that's 3 to 4 weeks after initial fertilization occurred. And then they consume their shell and any unhatched siblings. They then reach their adolescent stage about a week after hatching, and snails are about 10 times their previous size after this. It's important that they grow quickly because it makes them less likely to be stepped on or consumed. They reach their adult stage about a month after hatching, and they are then at full size. And they reach their mature stage where they reach sexual maturity, and that's when they'll begin to mate. And if a snail has mated at least once, but particularly 3 or more times, then it'll be more likely to shoot love darts, and that'll make it more likely to serve as the male in the reproductive process and not have to carry eggs, because most snails prefer to not be pregnant. And they will be in this stage of life indefinitely or until they die. Source, range, and distribution. So the map on the right shows where they have a permanent residency, but these snails are considered an invasive species, so Oxyochilus salarius can be found in many places. This specific sample was found in Greensboro, North Carolina, and the snail has a clump distribution because it's only found in a few countries in the world. It's also found in very specific environments, which we'll discuss in the next slide. This organism originated in Europe and North America and was introduced to Africa and Oceania. The preferred habitat is that seen on the right. They are terrestrial organisms and they like to be found in humid areas. This makes sense because they have a slimy body. They're covered in mucus, as was found by the Chiles in the last part of the Oxyochilus word for their genus. And so a humid environment allows them to continually have this moisture that they need to survive. They're particularly common in deciduous forests, parks, gardens, compost bin, waste grounds, and greenhouses, and can often be found in arthropogenic environments where these conditions are set up, like a vegetable garden in the backyard or a puddle formed by a kid playing in the sand, anything like that. And their shells are an important adaptation to allow them to survive because they prevent the organism from being crushed by other animals. It's also similar to a turtle where they can retreat into their shell, and that will help them to not die because they'll be hidden from, say, a bird. And the bird could still get it, but it's a defense mechanism that they have. It's better than nothing. The primary ecological role of these organisms, and I have a diagram here on the right. This is the specific snail species that we're studying, but it still has all the same predators. And they're a source of calcium for many organisms. Like we talked about, their abundant need for calcium to make their shell. The other organisms are aware of this, and they'll consume them. Turkeys consume them 40 times more commonly during mating season than they otherwise would to provide nutrients for their eggs. So they're a major source of calcium, probably a keystone species in that regard. And if they were removed, calcium would be removed from the ecosystem, and that would be a major issue. So they eat decaying matter and they help recycle nutrients. They eat the decaying matter from the nutrients, bring them into their bodies, turn them into calcium and other necessary nutrients for their own survival. And then when they're consumed by other organisms, this goes up the food chain. They're a primary consumer as they consume mainly plants, and their higher order consumers would lack a food source if Oxyochilus salarius was removed from the ecosystem. And the analogy for this that can kind of show the severity of what would happen if they were removed from the ecosystem is that of Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. As she noted in her book, when DDT was causing severe harm to the calcium production availability of arthropods, meaning that arthropods couldn't produce calcium because of the chemical reaction with DDT, They were unable to pass this calcium up the food chain, and bald eagles were laying soft eggs that cracked, and their young were not able to hatch, and there were no new generations of bald eagles being produced. This is a major problem, as bald eagles are an endangered species. The same would likely happen if Oxyochilus salarius was removed from the ecosystem. There would no longer be the availability of calcium that was previously found, and birds and other animals that lay eggs would struggle because they wouldn't have the resources they need to have a firm eggshell that could allow their young to develop properly. Here are my references, and thank you for watching.